Have you ever wondered what a man is worth when he's lost everything but his honor? Step back to the winter of 1888 in the unforgiving heart of the Montana Territory, where a man could buy another soul for the price of a good horse. A solitary rancher did just that, purchasing a bride no one else would touch. But he could never have known that the face hidden beneath a woolen shawl would drag the ghosts of a bloody past right to his doorstep, demanding a final, violent reckoning. The wind that scoured the single, muddy street of Redemption Gulch carried the iron tang of coming snow and the sour smell of cheap whiskey. It was a miserable wind for a miserable town, a place that clung to the edge of the mountains like a scab. Inside the smoky confines of the Silver Slipper Saloon, Jacob Thorne stood apart from the other men, a tall, broad silhouette in a worn sheepskin coat. His presence was a weight in the room, a quiet gravity that came from a man long accustomed to his own company. The left side of his face was a road map of past troubles, a jagged scar that pulled at the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a war he tried daily to forget. He was here for supplies, but a different kind of transaction had drawn him in. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Silas Croft, was selling off the last of a failed merchant's assets. The final item was not a crate or a barrel. It was a person. "And now, gentlemen," Croft announced, his voice slick with contempt, "a rare commodity, fresh off the boat and the train, all the way from the Orient. A bride for some lonely prospector with more gold than sense." He gestured to a small figure huddled on a stool near the potbelly stove. All Jacob could see was a thin blanket and the hem of a strange pale pink dress, the silk utterly out of place against the grime of the saloon floor. The other men snickered and made coarse remarks. They saw a curiosity, a piece of exotic chattel. Jacob saw something else. He saw the tremor in the small hands clutching the blanket. He saw the same bone-deep loneliness that lived in his own chest. "What's wrong with her?" a miner called out. "Why'd the fellow who ordered her send her back?" Croft shrugged, a theatrical gesture of dismissal. "Picky bastard, I suppose. Said she wasn't what he was promised. Too quiet. Too stubborn. His loss is your gain. Bidding starts at $50. A wave of derisive laughter swept the room. $50 was a fortune. Men offered a spittoon, a half-empty bottle, a broken spur. The humiliation was the point. Jacob watched, his jaw tight. He hadn't come to town for a wife. His life was a closed loop of hard work and silence. His only companions a stubborn mule and the ghosts that whispered in the wind that swept down from the bitter roots. But the sight of this silent, shivering woman, treated as less than human, stirred an old, dormant instinct in him. It was the same instinct that made him stand on a battlefield when others ran. It was the duty to protect. $20, Jacob said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, but it cut through the noise like a cold knife. The room went silent. All eyes turned to the scarred rancher. Croft's eyes widened, genuinely surprised. $20 from Mr. Thorne. Do I hear 25? The men just stared. No one was going to bid against Jacob Thorne. Not because they feared him exactly, but because they didn't understand him, and that was close enough. He was an outsider, a man who kept to his high country ranch and his own counsel. To them, he was spending good money on damaged goods. "Sold," Croft said, slamming a bottle on the bar for emphasis. "To the solitary man for 20 silver dollars." Jacob placed the coins on the bar without a word, his gaze fixed on the small figure who was now, by the cruel laws of this land, his property. What he did not yet know was that his $20 had not bought him a bride. It had bought him a war. The journey back to his ranch was made in near silence, the carriage wheels crunching over the frozen mud of the trail. Jacob had paid the driver extra to take them all the way to his homestead, a remote spread nestled in a high valley that was beautiful in the summer and a frozen prison in the winter. The woman sat opposite him, never once looking up. He had given her his own coat, and she was swallowed by its bulk, the sheepskin collar brushing against her dark hair. He could smell the faint, foreign scent of jasmine or some other flower clinging to her, a scent of a world away from this harsh, pine-scented landscape. He wondered what she was thinking, what horrors she had endured to end up on an auction block in a town called Redemption Gulch. He didn't consider her his wife. He considered her a refugee, and his ranch a sanctuary. He had paid to free her, not to own her. When the carriage finally pulled up to the long, low-slung log cabin, the sun was a pale wafer sinking behind the snow-dusted peaks. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that felt like breathing glass. Jacob paid the driver, who gave the woman a final, pitying look before whipping his horses around and disappearing back down the trail, eager to be away before the real dark set in. Now they were alone, just the two of them, the cabin, his mule Patience in the lean-to, and the vast, indifferent wilderness. The quiet was absolute. He turned to her. "Welcome to my home," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "You'll be safe here." She finally lifted her head, pulling the shawl away from her face to look at him properly for the first time. And Jacob Thorne went pale. It wasn't her beauty that struck him, though she was beautiful, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of dark, stormy water. It was the mark. Seared into the delicate skin of her left cheek, from her temple to her jaw, was a brand. It was an intricate, ugly thing, a coiled serpent with a fanged mouth. It was a mark he knew. He had seen it before, burned into the flesh of men who had displeased their commander, a man of exquisite cruelty and bottomless greed. It was the personal crest of Baron Alistair Finch, a man Jacob had served under during the war, a man whose evil had driven Jacob to desert his post and flee to the farthest corners of the country to escape. He had thought he'd left that life behind, buried it under years of solitude and hard labor. But now, here it was, on the face of the woman standing on his porch. The past had not just found him, it had been delivered to his door. He felt the blood drain from his face, the old fear and rage coiling in his gut like a cold snake. The woman, seeing the shock in his eyes, flinched back, her own expression shuddering into one of resigned terror. She clearly thought his reaction was one of disgust at her disfigurement. She likely expected him to hit her, to cast her out into the coming night. It was a look he imagined she had seen many times. Jacob forced himself to breathe, to push down the storm of memories the brand had unleashed. This wasn't her fault. She was a victim of the same man who haunted his nightmares. He had to remember that. He gestured numbly toward the open cabin door. "Inside," he rasped, his voice sounding hollow. "It's getting cold." He led her into the main room, which was sparse but clean, dominated by a large stone fireplace where embers still glowed. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee. It was a man's space, functional and unadorned. He showed her to a small back room, barely large enough for the narrow cot and a single wooden chest. "This will be yours," he said, his voice still strained. "No one will bother you here." He placed a stack of thick wool blankets on the cot. They were rough, but they were warm. She stood in the doorway, a small, still figure in her incongruous pink silk dress, watching him with those dark, unreadable eyes. She said nothing. He didn't know if she couldn't speak English or if she was simply too afraid. He felt a chasm between them, a gulf of culture, language, and trauma. He backed out of the room, feeling like a clumsy giant. I'll make some food, he mumbled, retreating to the relative safety of the main room. He busied himself at the hearth, stoking the fire, putting a pot of water on to boil. He could feel her watching him from the doorway of her room. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the snow-laden clouds pressing down on the roof. He had brought her here to save her, but in doing so, he had brought the shadow of Baron Finch into his sanctuary. He was no longer just a solitary rancher. He was a man hiding a fugitive, and the stakes of his simple, isolated life had just been raised to a deadly new height. Days bled into a week marked only by the rising and setting of the pale winter sun. The woman, who he still didn't know the name of, remained a silent ghost in his home. He would leave a plate of food, stew, jerky, whatever he had, on the floor outside her door, and later the plate would be returned, empty and clean. He never saw her eat. He would hear the floorboards creak softly in the night, the faint rustle of movement, but by the time he rose before dawn, she would be back in her room, the door closed. The pink silk dress disappeared, replaced by a spare pair of his own woolen trousers and a shirt which she had somehow tailored with neat, precise stitches to fit her small frame. She was resourceful, he'd give her that, but the silence was a wall between them, and her fear was a palpable thing in the small cabin. She would flinch if he moved too quickly, her eyes darting to his hands as if expecting a blow. The brand on her cheek seemed to mock him, a constant reminder of the danger they were both in. Then the blizzard came. It descended from the mountains without warning, a swirling white fury that erased the world. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, piling snow into massive drifts that buried the fences and pressed against the cabin walls. For 3 days they were trapped, the world reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin. The relentless wind and the crushing isolation forced a change. They could no longer exist as 2 separate ghosts in the same space. Survival demanded proximity. On the 2nd day, the fire, their only source of heat, began to die down. Jacob, weary from a sleepless night spent listening to the roof groan under the weight of the snow, went to the woodpile near the door only to find the last of the split logs were damp. He cursed under his breath, his shoulder aching from the effort of clearing a path to the barn earlier. As he struggled with a stubborn, wet log, a small hand appeared beside his. She took the small hatchet from him, her movements deft and sure. She found the driest part of the log, and with a series of quick, efficient strikes, she split it into fine kindling. Then she took the pieces to the hearth and began to arrange them with a patient, practiced skill he had never mastered. Within minutes, a small, healthy flame was catching, growing into a steady, life-giving fire. He watched her, stunned into silence. It was the first time she had initiated any action, the first time she had moved toward him instead of away. Later that day, he found her in the small pantry, taking stock of their meager supplies. She held up a shriveled onion and a few hearty potatoes. She looked at him, a questioning look in her eyes. He nodded, and she set to work, cutting the vegetables with a small knife, her hands moving with an economy and grace that was mesmerizing. She made a thin but hot broth, and when she handed him a bowl, their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. Her skin was soft, a stark contrast to his own calloused, scarred hands. It was the first human touch he'd felt in years. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but a deep, weary sadness. The wall between them had not crumbled, but a single stone had been dislodged. The quiet that followed was different. It was no longer a silence of fear, but one of shared existence, of 2 lonely people weathering the same storm together. The blizzard finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine, silent snow. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the sunlight sparkling on the drifts was almost blinding. Jacob spent the morning digging out, clearing a path to the barn to check on Patience, who was thankfully unharmed, merely cantankerous from the confinement. As he worked, a flicker of movement on the far ridge caught his eye. He froze, squinting against the glare. 2 riders, silhouetted against the sky. They were too far away to make out any details, but they weren't his neighbors, and no one came up this high in the winter without a purpose. They sat on their horses for a long moment, looking down into his valley, before turning and disappearing over the ridge. A cold dread settled in Jacob's stomach. They were scouts, Finch's men. The Baron knew. That night, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. The shared fragile peace of the storm was gone, replaced by a shared unspoken dread. Jacob was cleaning his Winchester rifle by the firelight, the methodical click and slide of the mechanism a grim counterpoint to the crackling flames. He looked over at the woman who sat at the small table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He had to know. He had to understand the full scope of the danger they faced. "Finch," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "you have to tell me everything." She looked up, her eyes wide with a familiar fear, but this time something else was there too, a flicker of defiance. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and then she began to speak. Her voice was soft but clear, her English accented but precise and educated. "My name is Leanne," she said. She told him her story. She was not a peasant girl sold into servitude. Her father had been a wealthy silk merchant in San Francisco who had entered into a business deal with Baron Finch. Finch, true to his nature, had cheated him, ruining him and seizing all his assets, including his daughter, as collateral. When her father protested, Finch had him killed. To make an example of her, to show all his associates the price of defiance, he had branded her with his serpent crest and shipped her east to be sold as a bride, a final, cruel humiliation. She had been bought and returned 3 times, her spirit refusing to break. Her silence and the ugly mark on her face making her an undesirable property. Jacob listened, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. The story confirmed everything he knew about the Baron, a man who saw people as pawns, as possessions, his cruelty limited only by his imagination. When she finished, a single tear traced a path down her unmarked cheek. He felt a surge of protective fury so intense it made him dizzy. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He shared a piece of his own broken past. "I served under him in the war," he said, his voice a low growl. "I saw him order men to their deaths for his own amusement. I saw him burn a village because they wouldn't give him their food. The scar on my face, he gave it to me with the hilt of his saber after I refused an order to execute a prisoner." He looked into her eyes, wanting her to understand. "I ran. I deserted. I came here to be somewhere he could never find me. I was wrong." In that moment, they were no longer a rancher and his purchased bride. They were 2 survivors, 2 fugitives, bound together by the shared hatred of a common enemy. The shadow of Baron Finch had not just fallen over his ranch. It had forged an alliance in the heart of the winter wilderness. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm took hold. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface of their days, but it was no longer the paralyzing terror of before. It was a whetstone upon which they sharpened their resolve. They became a team, their movements around the small cabin and the snowy ranch yard falling into a kind of unspoken dance. Jacob taught her the ways of the high country. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to bank the fire so it would smolder through the night without consuming all their precious wood. He found she was a quick study. her mind sharp and her observations keen. She, in turn, brought a quiet grace to the harshness of his life. She organized the chaotic pantry, her neatness a small act of defiance against the wildness outside. She found a patch of hardy winter herbs near a frozen creek and used them to make their bland stew taste of something other than salt and desperation. One afternoon, he came into the cabin to find her sitting by the window, a piece of charcoal from the fire in her hand. She was sketching on a piece of discarded parchment he used for lists. He looked over her shoulder and saw she had drawn Patience, his mule, with astonishing detail, capturing the animal's stubborn, cantankerous spirit in a few deft lines. He was struck by the talent, by the glimpse into the life she must have had before Finch destroyed it. "You're very good," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up, startled, and a faint blush colored her unscarred cheek. "My father hired a tutor for me in San Francisco," she whispered. "I was to paint landscapes." The simple, devastating statement of what had been lost hung in the air between them. Another evening, as he was mending a piece of tack, he sliced his palm open on a sharp buckle. It was a clumsy, stupid mistake born of exhaustion. Before he could react, Leanne was there with a clean rag and a tin of salve. She took his large, calloused hand in her small, delicate ones and began to clean the wound. Her touch was feather-light, her focus absolute. He sat frozen, watching her, the scent of the medicinal herbs filling his senses. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, to the feeling of her fingers against his skin. The air grew thick, charged with a current of unspoken yearning. He could see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He had an overwhelming urge to lean forward, to touch the brand on her cheek, not with pity, but with a tenderness that might somehow erase the pain of its creation. But he didn't. The moment was too fragile, too new. When she finished, she wrapped his hand in a clean bandage, her eyes never quite meeting his. But the intimacy of the act lingered long after she had moved away, a silent promise of something more than just survival. The arrival of the single rider shattered their fragile peace. He came at midday, when the sun was high and the snow was beginning to melt in slushy patches, a harbinger of a false spring. He was not a scout. This man was an emissary. He rode a fine black horse and wore a tailored coat that looked ridiculously out of place in the rugged landscape. He dismounted without being invited, a smug, cruel smile on his face. Jacob met him on the porch, his Winchester held loosely in his hands. Leanne watched from the shadows of the doorway. "Thorne," the man said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The Baron sends his regards. He is a forgiving man. He understands you made a foolish, perhaps even chivalrous mistake. He is willing to overlook it." The man tossed a heavy leather pouch onto the porch. It landed with the solid, clinking sound of gold coins. "That is for your trouble. The Baron simply wants his property returned. The girl. Send her out now, and we can all forget this unfortunate business." Jacob looked from the gold to the man's sneering face. He felt Leanne stiffen behind him. He thought of her quiet competence, of the way she sketched the mule, of the gentle way she had tended his hand. He thought of the brand on her face and the monster who had put it there. The choice was not a choice at all. "There's no property here that belongs to him," Jacob said, his voice dangerously low. "This is my ranch, and she is under my protection. Take your gold and get off my land." The man's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You fool. Do you have any idea who you are defying? The Baron always collects what is his. This is your only warning." He turned, swinging himself back onto his horse. "You have made a grave error, Thorne." he will come for her, and he will burn this whole pathetic valley to the ground to get her. The man spurred his horse, riding away without a backward glance, the pouch of gold lying forgotten in the snow. Jacob turned to Leanne. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing with a fire he had never seen before. The time for hiding was over. The war had come to them. They began to prepare for the siege, knowing the next riders would not come to talk. They worked through the night and the following day, their movements synchronized by a shared, grim purpose. There was no need for discussion. They both knew what was coming. Jacob boarded up the smaller windows, leaving only narrow slits to shoot from. He checked his ammunition, laying out cartridges on the main table. He had the Winchester, an old Army-issue Colt revolver, and a double-barreled shotgun. It wasn't an arsenal, but he was a good shot, and he knew his land. Leanne proved to be an invaluable partner. She melted snow for water, filling every available pot and bucket. She prepared food that didn't need cooking, hardtack and jerky, and stacked it near the hearth. She tore strips from old flour sacks to use as bandages. There was no panic in her actions, only a cold, focused efficiency. She was no longer the terrified victim he had brought from town. She was a soldier preparing for battle. The quiet intimacy of the past weeks had been forged into something harder, a partnership tempered by the certainty of impending violence. They came at dawn on the second day. Jacob saw them first, a line of dark figures on the white ridge, their forms stark against the pink and orange sky. There were 6 of them, including the Baron himself, who sat on his fine black horse, a specter of arrogant authority. They didn't charge. They were professionals. They dismounted at the edge of the tree line, using the pines for cover as they advanced on the cabin. The first shot came from a sharpshooter, a puff of smoke from the trees, and a bullet thudded into the log wall just inches from the slit where Jacob was watching. The siege had begun. The next few hours were a blur of smoke, noise, and adrenaline. Jacob fired sparingly, making every shot count. He was a veteran, and his movements were economical and precise. He would fire, then move to a different window, never giving them a stationary target. Leanne was right beside him, a silent, steady presence in the chaos. She loaded the spare shotgun, her hands never trembling. When the Colt ran empty, she was there with fresh cartridges. She watched the blind spots, her dark eyes missing nothing. At one point, 2 of Finch's men tried to rush the front door, using a heavy log as a battering ram. Jacob fired the shotgun through the door, the blast echoing like a cannon in the small cabin. One man fell screaming, the other retreated back to the trees. But they were closing in. A bullet shattered the last pane of glass in the main window, spraying the room with glittering shards. As Jacob moved to a new position, a searing pain ripped through his left shoulder. He cried out, stumbling back, the rifle clattering to the floor. A bullet had torn through the muscle, a deep, bleeding gouge. He clutched at the wound, his vision swimming. For a terrifying moment he thought it was over. He saw Finch's men begin to advance from the trees, sensing the pause in the defense. They were going to be overrun. He looked at Leanne, a silent apology in his eyes. But he did not see fear on her face. He saw fire. Leanne did not scream. She did not panic. Seeing Jacob fall, something inside her shifted from defense to attack. She grabbed one of the lanterns from the mantelpiece, its flame burning steadily. Her eyes darted around the room, settling on the lean-to barn, where a small supply of hay was stored. Without a word, she ran to the back door, unlatched it, and slipped out into the snow, using the cabin itself as cover. Finch's men were focused on the front, on the wounded man inside. They didn't see the small figure sprinting across the yard. With a desperate heave, she threw the lit lantern through the open hayloft window. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a bloom of orange light appeared, followed by a whoosh as the dry hay ignited. Flames erupted from the barn, black smoke billowing into the cold morning air. The horses, tied near the tree line, began to scream and pull at their reins. Patience, the mule, kicked her stall to pieces and bolted into the yard, braying in terror. The carefully orchestrated attack dissolved into chaos. In the confusion, Baron Finch, enraged at the loss of control, did something his men would not. He charged the cabin himself, kicking in the weakened front door, his face a mask of fury, a dueling pistol in his hand. He was coming for his property. Jacob, struggling to his feet with his wounded shoulder, met him in the center of the room. The two men collided, a tangle of limbs and desperation. Finch was strong, but he was a gentleman fighter, used to clean duels. Jacob was a survivor, fighting with the raw, brutal strength of a man with nothing left to lose. They crashed through the door frame and back out into the snow. Finch raised his pistol to finish him, but Jacob slammed his good shoulder into the Baron's chest, sending them both tumbling down the slight incline toward the half-frozen creek. Finch lost his grip on the pistol. As they grappled in the slush and ice, the panicked mule, Patience, galloped past. One of her powerful back legs lashed out, a random act of animal terror. The hoof connected with the side of Finch's head with a sickening crack. The Baron went limp, his body sliding into the icy water of the creek. The current, sluggish but strong, pulled him under. The remaining henchmen, seeing their leader fall and the fire raging, mounted their panicked horses and fled. As the sound of their retreat faded, an eerie silence fell over the valley, broken only by the crackle of the burning barn. It was over. Leanne rushed to Jacob's side, helping him to his feet. She led him back into the smoky cabin, her expression a mixture of relief and grim determination. As the adrenaline faded, the pain in his shoulder flared, and he slumped into a chair. She carefully cut away the fabric of his shirt, her hands gentle as she examined the wound. It was bloody, but the bullet had gone clean through. She cleaned it with whiskey, her touch firm and steady as he gritted his teeth against the sting. As she worked, he reached up with his good hand and gently, so gently, touched the brand on her cheek. The coiled serpent, the mark of the man now lying at the bottom of the creek. "It's over, Leanne," he whispered, his voice hoarse. She stopped her work, her dark eyes searching his. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, a gesture of profound, shared relief. In the ruins of their battle, surrounded by smoke and silence, they were finally, truly safe. Spring came to the high valley as if the violence had scoured the winter away, making room for new life. The snow melted, swelling the creek that had claimed the Baron, washing away the last traces of the fight. The world turned green. The burned-out shell of the barn was cleared away, and with lumber from the town, Jacob and Leanne began to build a new one, working side by side under the warm sun. The scar on Jacob's shoulder faded to a pale line, and the brand on Leanne's cheek, no longer a mark of ownership, became just another part of her story, a faint tracing on her skin. The silence that had once defined their lives was replaced by easy companionship. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their pasts, dreams for their future. He learned of her life in San Francisco, of her love for art and music. She learned of his childhood on a farm back east, of the reasons he joined the army, and the weight of the things he had seen. Their home was no longer just a cabin. It was a place of healing. Leanne planted a small garden, and the bright colors of her flowers were a defiant splash of beauty against the rugged landscape. Jacob found himself smiling more than he had in a decade. The harsh lines of his face softened by a peace he thought he would never know. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of purple and gold, he reached over and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of everything they had endured and everything they had become. her fingers laced with his, a perfect fit. They had been brought together by violence and cruelty, two broken people in a harsh and unforgiving land. But in the crucible of survival, they had forged something stronger than steel. They had found not just safety, but a home. And not just companionship, but a quiet, resilient love that was as real and enduring as the mountains themselves. The story of Jacob and Leanne is a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unlikely of places, and the deepest bonds are forged in the hottest fires. It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of kindness to heal even the deepest wounds. If their journey from survival to love resonated with you, please consider giving this video a like. Share it with someone who appreciates a story of strength and redemption. And for more tales from the untamed heart of the frontier, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of their story did you find the most powerful?